All right, so I'm going to do a little reading with you guys with my little boy Elijah here. And we are going to be reading from Science and Faith by Eric Gans. Eric Gans was a student of Rene Girard. And I'm going to read chapter 4, some of chapter 4, entitled The Christian Revelation. And quickly from the back of the book here. Science and Faith recapitulates, focuses, and recontextualizes much of the thinking done by Eric Gans' two books that introduces this new way of thinking. Generative Anthropology, that is the discipline that he originated. The Origin of Language, a Formal Theory of Representation from 1981, and The End of Culture Toward a Generative Anthropology, 1985. Science and Faith conceives religious revelation as a cognitive phenomenon, a method for the discovery of human truth. The anthropological truths contained in biblical and other religious texts cannot be perceived by those who treat them as ethnological artifacts. Religion remains faithful to the conception of human origin as an event, a hypothesis non-generative anthropologies refuse to consider. Gans argues that only a human science that respects this fundamental religious intuition is capable of assimilating the human self-understanding on which human Western culture, including its science, is founded. Without concern for disciplinary boundaries, Science and Faith asks the most fundamental questions in the best traditions of the human sciences and the Enlightenment. It will reward a reader similarly willing to, quote-unquote, unlearn preconceptions regarding the quote-unquote appropriate scope of inquiry regarding the human. Science and Faith is an intellectually demanding as it is open to all readers prepared to set aside fashionable prejudices about the untenability of speculation about human origins. This new edition of Science and Faith includes a new preface by author and a new foreword by series editor. So again, here, join me as I read from chapter 4 from Science and Faith. And let's see if anything interesting pops up. A bit of change in plans here. I had to put the little guy down for a nap. And I'm going to be reading from the conclusion. The conclusion is entitled Science and Faith. It's a little bit shorter, and it'll kind of give you an idea of, doesn't give away the book, but it'll give you an idea of what the book's about. It's a very dense, kind of postmodern, post-postmodern. The language in it is a little bit esoteric, but not really, actually. So I would suggest grabbing this book and checking it out if these ideas interest you. So here we go. Conclusion, Science and Faith. The barrier that separates religious belief from scientific theory seems easy enough to locate, if not to demolish. Science proposes hypothetical models, verifiable in principle. Faith presents its founding truths as self-justifying. By agreeing to define the opposition in formal terms and to avoid discussions of content, the believer and the scientist succeed in averting confrontation. Neither side is anxious for dialogue, particularly when both sides coexist in the same individual. It is not by chance that the only subject over which faith and science still come to blows is that of the origin of man. The creationists, or, quote, creation scientists, insist that Genesis be taught to children alongside or even in place of the theory of evolution. It is easy to deride those who reject the Darwinian theory out of hand because it, quote, makes man descend from monkeys, close quote. The affirmation that God created man in his own image is not a sufficient foundation for anthropological science. But if the alternative proposed by creationism is insufficient, the question it raises cannot be swept aside with such good scientific conscience. As we saw in the beginning of this work, the theory of biological evolution does not explain the emergence of man. The Bible is a better source of materials for the solution of this problem than the Alduvi Gorge. Human science has done well to purge itself of religious faith, but it is still unable to assimilate the event-linked anthropological truth that faith transmits. The truth is by no means limited, as both creationists and evolutionists seem equally ready to believe, to the narrative of the first chapter of Genesis. The story of the passion or the moral diatribes of the prophets provide a far more precious insights into the evolution of human consciousness than volumes of primitive myths. The scientist's inability to make use of these texts is easy to understand. Scientific methodology by means of which man has conquered nature and transformed the world abhors dogmatic affirmation. The Bible does not present hypotheses. It affirms revealed truths. But the Bible is an invaluable source of anthropological hypotheses for the human scientist who has understood that man is from the beginning the product of a particular, not a universal, history. Cultural affirmations, however dogmatic, of the influence of specific revelatory events on this history are not mere artifacts for ethnological classification. Their conceptual content is of direct anthropological interest. The believers, for their part, have equally unable to translate their offended intuition into a dialogue with science. The militant defenders of this intuition have a deficient understanding of the spiritual needs of modernity and no concept whatever of its intellectual needs. In contrast with the militant sects, the great churches have learned to make their peace with human science, but without ever perceiving the contribution that the revealed truths they cherish could make to it. Faith is generally opposed to reason on a naively phenomenological level in terms equally unfair to both. Quote-unquote faith and quote-unquote reason, construed as the religious attitude and the scientific attitude, are dubious abstractions. If faith can be reduced to an attitude, then the mythology of an Amazonian tribe is as valid as the theology of Thomas Aquinas. Indeed, it is more so, for the latter attempted to formalize the structures of his belief, whereas his primitive counterpart has the good taste to leave this task to the ethnologist. Only by taking into account the content of faith can one begin to conceive its synthesis with scientific thought. But to do this would require us to take seriously the content of our own Judeo-Christian tradition, something that only the least sophisticated still have the ethnocentric bad form to do. The theological endpoint of this tradition, the doctrine of the Trinity, has provided us with a model closely homologous to that of our anthropological hypothesis. Skeptics might call this a suspiciously easy triumph. On the one hand, our theory may be modeled unconsciously or by design on Judeo-Christian theology. On the other, the quote-unquote anthropological notions we find in religious texts have little in common with the meanings that believers traditionally attribute to them. The Western religious tradition has been marked more than any other by the liberation of the scene of representation from ritual constraints and by the assertion of human mastery over it. The ancient Greeks were perhaps the first people to display systematic intellectual curiosity, but the scientific method is a product of Western Christian civilization with its roots in medieval nominalism. The association of modern science with the Christian West cannot be explained away, nor does the fact that the early scientists were opposed by the Church constitute a counter-demonstration. Yet the relationship between biblical theology and natural science is relatively distant, and a considerable intellectual effort is required to mediate between the two. The claim of this book is both stronger and more easily demonstrable. Not merely does the theological liberation provided by the Judeo-Christian tradition facilitate the development of scientific thought, but the contents of this tradition are themselves contributions to scientific thought. Natural science is a consequence of intellectual liberation, but it does not concern itself with this liberation. In contrast, human science cannot ignore the conditions of its own origin, because self-understanding is an essential characteristic of man. I would go farther and assert that it is the essential characteristic of man. Language emerged in order to represent the conditions of its own emergence. Ritual and myth are models of man's origin. Even the most primitive culture is, quote-unquote, theoretical, not because of some mysterious human drive to, quote, disinterested contemplation, close quote, but because man's survival depends on his ability to reproduce the communal peace of the originary event. The primary purpose of man's language and other systems of representation is to maintain and reinforce the order that this event instituted among creatures who could no longer operate under the conditions of animal societies. Quote-unquote, know thyself is man's categorical imperative. Religion can most simply be defined as the activity that commemorates human origin. Animals have communication systems, but they have no religion because they have no originary event to commemorate. Once we're able to recognize that religion is the essential pre-scientific form of practical anthropological knowledge, then it becomes altogether reasonable that the religious foundation of the most highly developed and successful social system should contain a reservoir of material of value to anthropologists. The interest of this material appears all the greater when one observes positive anthropology's failure not merely to solve, but even to formulate the essential questions relevant either to defining man's difference from his fellow primates or to constructing a theoretical model of his emergence. Just as the lowly Hebrews and not their Egyptian masters developed the first modern religious system, so it may well be the role of scientific quote-unquote amateurs to develop the first generative anthropology. As in many other examples of the, quote, law of unequal development, close quote, the inhabitants of the margins have the advantage of observing a wider field than those fixed in the center of things. In defending our use of biblical material, there is a temptation we must avoid. The little word metaphor lends a facile respectability to religious and even superstitious practices. But the weakening of homologies to metaphors clears the ground of controversy so well that it leaves no residue by which one could decide the false from the true. The apologists for metaphoric religion would have us believe that religion consists of some excellent moral beliefs with a gratuitous supernatural element thrown in. They reassure us that the latter is no real obstacle because we can admire the moral doctrine while understanding the supernatural as quote-unquote metaphorical. Yet it is not the attachment to supernatural beings, but to historical particularity that differentiates religious faith from scientific hypothesis. The supernatural is a system of reinforcement, the credo qua absurdum, that encourages the believer to repulse the temptations of a simple-minded rationalism. It is very fine to seek to understand the world with one's unaided reason, but the latter is by no means guaranteed to bring one closer to the truth than dogmatic acceptance of the faith of one's own ancestors. The supernatural serves as a guardrail for the person who risks losing his faith in the historically specific for lack of logical justification. We have all experienced this sort of argument, most frequently political, in which our adversary gains a dialectical triumph without changing any of our convictions. As we return to our home base to sharpen our polemic swords, we rely on reassuring figures that allow us to feel in the right on what today are called a little too easily, quote-unquote, myths. Religion, whose basis in experience is farther from daily life than politics, surrounds the revelation that is its object of faith with such provocative myths. These may be, quote-unquote, demythologized without difficulty into metaphors, but this procedure will not lead us to the historical object of faith. On the contrary, the reduction of the dogma of faith to a plethora of metaphors and symbols puts us at a great risk of defining not a religious experience, but a literary one. By dint of humanizing Christianity, one obtains a quote-unquote humanitarian, Jesus, who makes a fine romantic hero, but who is incapable of bearing either the historical weight or the anthropological truth of the Christian experience. The process of demythologization gets caught up in the details and forgets about preserving the sense of the whole. A structure like the Trinity, so rich in anthropological insights, can be purged of its mythical components only once these insights have been recognized and absorbed. Even the most subtle dialectic cannot assimilate the believer's existential intuition of divine presence to a hypothesis of human science. But that is not my aim, and this quote-unquote believer is perhaps more difficult to find today than one might think. Even the toughest faith will be worn down through contact with science unless it makes the effort to understand that it has nothing to lose in this contact but its resistance to the free examination of its truths. These truths are real, and faith does not have to sacrifice to science. On the contrary, it should insist that science take them into account. For the truth of man is at once eternal and historic, and a science too ensnared in metaphysics to recognize this proves to be less of a science than faith itself. That is the chapter. Thanks for listening.